Module 4, the historical setting of the Gospels. What events led up to the context of the Gospel accounts? So what we want to do here is we want to really try and see if we can understand how the world of the Gospels became that particular world. But before we get to that, just a quick review on what we covered in our previous module. So we looked at prologues and genealogies in Module 3, and we talked about how Luke's prologue outlines his purpose for his gospel, whereas John's prologue really outlines who Jesus is from his pre-incarnate perspective, as well as his deity, his divinity. And which of course played into why he came to the earth. We also talked about the two genealogies of Jesus in the Gospels: Matthew's genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, and Luke's genealogy in Luke 3. Matthew's, of course, focusing on Jesus's his Jewish lineage or his royal lineage, focusing or beginning with Abraham and going through the line of Joseph, whereas Luke focusing on how Jesus is the Savior of the world, went through the line of Mary, and of course started with all the way back with Adam. We started studying those by looking at the harmony of the Gospels. So we looked at the prologues, kind of starting there, just going through that list sequentially, and then followed next, we looked at the genealogy. So all of that, of course, is what we covered in Module 3. But what we want to do in this module is we really want to now look at the most important historical events between the Old Testament and the New Testament. These are the events that set up the world of the New Testament. So what we want to do is we want to first talk about the major periods of time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So let's introduce those here, and we're going to unpack them throughout this module. So the first one is the Persian period. The Old Testament ends during this particular period. It goes from 539 to 334 BC. It's followed by the Greek period. Then there's a period called either the Maccabees or the period of Jewish independence. That went from 166 BC up to 63 BC. And then, of course, we have the Roman period, which is where the setting of the New Testament takes place, starting in BC 63 up to AD 135. So these are the four main periods in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And before we start looking at them, though, there's a couple important things we want to know. So first off, this time is called the intertestamental period. Of course, this is between the two testaments, Old Testament, New Testament. But what's really interesting and what we want to keep in mind, because we're going to see this over and over, was how conquering empires treated those who they conquered. Because they had two different ways of treating those people whom they conquered. So let's talk about these two, because these will show up over and over again. So the first way that a conquering nation treated those who they conquered was called assimilation. So assimilation, what that meant was that the conqueror forced the conquered to adopt their culture. So Babylon would be a good example of this. If you look at the book of Daniel, you see that they very purposefully try and convert Daniel and his friends to become Babylonians. They try and assimilate them into the Babylonian culture. So that would be a good example of assimilation. Whereas the second way that conquering nations treated those whom they conquered was called affirmation. So with affirmation, the idea is that the conqueror pretty much allowed those who they conquered to continue to worship as they desired. So Persia would be an example of this. So would Rome. These did not necessarily try and convert them into their own culture. They were still ruling over them, but they respected those people groups and allowed them to kind of worship as they pleased. So that's a little bit of an outline of the four periods we're going to look at in this module. The Persian period, which is the end of the New Testament, the Greek period, the period of the Maccabees and Jewish independence, as well as the Roman period, which will set us up to continue our study going through the gospel accounts. So what we want to do first, though, is we want to do an Old Testament overview. Let's look at the events before all the way through the Old Testament that set up this intertestamental period.